Good evening. I wanted to do a little theorizing, amateur theorizing here, and talk about sort of the idea between symmetric rules versus asymmetric rules, primarily in tabletop games. But we'll use examples from board games just to get sort of the idea. So, what am I talking about with symmetric and asymmetric? Symmetric and asymmetric symmetric means that the rules apply to all players or both sides, NPCs and PCs, equally. Chess is very easy. The only asymmetric rule is who goes first. Otherwise, the rules play out the same for both players. Risk, the rules play the same for all players. Monopoly. A lot of board games that we think about when we think of board games are symmetric. Asymmetric would be a lot of other board games I think about when I think about board games, but games like Twilight Imperium and Eclipse are a little asymmetric in that you might have different factions, and so they have ways to break the rules. Magic Realm is asymmetric. Though the rules are the same for all the characters, they all have slightly different rules to go with those rule sets. So that's a little bit of asymmetry. Games like Victory Games Vietnam, a lot of asymmetry. You have the Viet Cong and you have the United States and the Allied forces, the South Vietnamese and the U.S. They have very different rules in many cases. Same thing with Victory Games Civil War. The Confederates and the Union have slightly different rule sets to just show the different capabilities of the different forces. In tabletop RPGs, there's a lot of rules that are sort of by default asymmetric, I think, because the players are the players, right? Because you're focused on one group, and the other group sort of is just background or cannon fodder or secondary, right? They are NPCs versus PCs, and we want to focus on the PCs. So PCs typically have more rules devoted to them, right? They are more defined and more detailed. And there's not a problem with that. In fact, that's by design, and I think that's fine, right? But things like in RPGs, let's take a D&D, hit points. Hit points are symmetrical for the most part. They're symmetric. When you hit an enemy, its hit points go down. When you hit a player, their hit points go down. Boom, they go down the same. There you go. So that's symmetric. Asymmetry. Well, it depends. Depends a lot on the system. But for instance, one place where we saw asymmetry was when we played Crown and Skull. Crown and Skull the monsters had hit points, and they were defined entirely differently than characters. Characters were defined absolutely differently than monsters in Crown and Skull. In Crown and Skull, monsters had this handful of stats: hit points, attack, defense, the phases they go on, and the number of attacks they get each time they get to go. They also had a little chart to determine what they did. Right? And that was the definition. And characters just have skills and gear. That's pretty much, and maybe one core ability, and that is their definition. So no stats, no attack stat, no defense stat, no hit points. Their list of skills and their list of gear was their hit points effectively through the attrition system. So, asymmetrical. Deliberately so, but asymmetrical. And that's fine. Other things that could be asymmetrical are games like in 4th edition D&D, where you explicitly have minions. You explicitly have enemies with a single hit point. And there you go. So that's the idea. That's the idea of symmetry versus asymmetry. Is, do the rules apply to both sides equally? So you might go, well, okay, that's great. So what? Okay. So the thing that I really wanted to talk about is, let's focus on asymmetry. And not to say, oh, why is it bad? But let's talk about asymmetry and think about why you have to be careful when you apply it. So in the case of, say, deliberate asymmetry, so the asymmetry where the rules explicitly are different between the two groups, players and NPCs. I think you have to watch out for what do you want to call it? Let's say rules complexity, and let's call it narrative gaps. How's that? So there you go. There we go. I've got bullet points. Complexity. So obviously you're adding some complexity to the game because you now have to write literally two different rule systems. The systems for players getting damaged in Crown and Skull is absolutely different than monsters getting damaged in Crown and Skull. It's two different sets of rules. If you had a single set of rules, it's just simpler, right? Absolutely. Not a huge deal. I mean, every game, makes it, and Crown and Skull was not complex, so it wasn't like you broke the bank with say a Crown and Skull. So let's not worry about complexity too much, but just understand that when you add a rule and that rule is asymmetric, that you're going to have to deal with, well, what about if the other side does that? And probably thus have to write another set of rules. So minions in fourth have to have a small portion of the rule set. I should pull out my fourth and see how much page space is devoted to minions. But I'm not going to do it because it's propping my monitor up. I like fourth. I think fourth is a great tactical minis game with Dungeons and Dragons slapped on it, but it was not a good role-playing game, right? It wasn't a good dungeon RPG, in my opinion. Now, some people got mileage out of it, so keep that in. But anyway, so rules complexity, that's one thing. The other thing would be what I call narrative gaps, and the narrative gaps in an asymmetric rule come from, the fact that your rules essentially set things up, right? When you say, a character has 100 hit points and a sword does 1d8, then obviously you are sort of vaguely explaining that narratively at some point. You are going, well, they're not actually getting hit and bleeding out. You are maybe taking a hit off the armor that doesn't quite do any damage, or you're dodging and it tires you out, and finally you strike the big blow. Well, how does that work? Presumably for minions, they always get struck down. Okay, that's fine. But you are creating this narrative story with the rules. The rules mean something, right? When you lose hit points, it means something. In Crown and Skull, it means something when you take attrition because you lose skills and you lose gear. So you can tell a story with that. And that is a benefit of the attrition system. And it's better than hit points in that sense because hit points don't tell a great story. The story is, well, you're getting whittled down and you're tiring out and finally you will be hurt. Whereas in Crown and Skull, you can say, your jaw got broken and your lantern is shattered. Cool, right? That's actually sort of cool. When I say there's a narrative gap in those asymmetric rules, what I'm saying is, but nothing ever shatters on a monster. Let's say you had the lantern bearer and he had flames come out his lantern and an axe. And he has 50 hit points. When you do 5 hit points, nothing happens to him, right? So there's a narrative gap. Whereas you're losing your lantern all day, your players have to go through 50 hit points and then that guy dies. And so there's this weird narrative gap. Can they break the lantern? Well, yeah, but I have to make that up, right? Whereas over here, those lanterns break. When that story is told. And I'm not saying that's better or worse, but I'm saying in a symmetrical game, there is no gap in how you're describing those things. A narrative gap for like minions in 4th edition. And I love minions. I use them in Runebear, right? I go, yeah, those guys are one hit. You hit them. If you do more than 3 points of damage, you kill them, kind of thing. And if not, I don't count it at all. But then the question is things like, but for instance, okay, so there you, okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Give me a second. So minions in 4th, they have 1 hit point. What if I toss caltrops on the ground? Do they take a hit point and die instantly? Like, is that how you beat them? And you go, well, no, the GM probably like, nah, you can't do that, right? Or the rules go, but there's a gap. There's a narrative gap there because, you know, you could have players that will run over those caltrops and take a point of damage if they fail a save or if they don't go slowly. But the minions sort of can't, or they do, right? It's those weird little things that the gap in the rules cause. They cause your players to go, well, what if I did this? Or what if this happens? And you have to go, well, let me look that up. Or I'll have to make a ruling. But again, I don't know that matters, right? Because you can just say, well, no, the minions, that happens to the minions, or they don't, or they make a save, or they go slowly through the caltrops. Like, you can probably work that. You can probably make up a ruling so the players can break the lantern warden's lantern in Crown and Skull. You probably can do all that. Where I'm actually going with all this is the inadvertent asymmetry. And I sort of almost accidentally fell into it when I talked about Rune Bear. So let's say I make minions in Rune Bear. I said, you know what, we're gonna have minions in Rune Bear. What is a minion? It has one hit. If you do more than X points of damage, like Maid, it has 2 points of armor, and so if you do 3 or more points, it goes away, kind of thing. And that way we can have a dozen dudes fighting 3 players, and they still feel super powerful. There's threat there because, in Rune Bear, your defenses degrade, so you might be a really great dodge or blocker, but if you have 6 guys on you, that doesn't work so well. So it's very dangerous, and minions would work really well, though. But minions inadvertently nerf certain things that characters can shoot for on their characters and go get in their characters. So, for instance, if a character has a weapon that causes bleeding, or they've taken perks or talents that cause bleeding, and bleeding is a hit point around, well, what does that do for a minion? You've just made a rule that now makes certain. So what if the character actually spent resources trying to get his character to be able to make you bleed more, because that was what he was going for? Inadvertently, you've made this sort of asymmetrical, you made this rule that now sort of penalizes these guys over here and makes some things like area effect attacks that do little tiny bits of damage somehow really powerful. So now if your game design is entirely built around that, like if you can figure that out, like Fourth had a lot of that. Like you had characters that were controllers, you had characters who did AoE damage, and the idea was to clear minions. So you can build your game around that asymmetry. Games like Root, where no one plays by the same rules. You can play that game and go, okay, I can make this game, build it around this asymmetry, and it will work. So in Fourth's case, I think they did a fine job, and it all sort of works out. But if you aren't building your game around those asymmetries and you accidentally toss them in by adding rules like I just did, or let's say we homebrew. Let's say we're playing first edition D&D and we decide it'd be a great idea to have an injury table. If your character gets hit and the enemy rolled a 20, injury. Same thing. If you roll a 20, injury. You do an injury to the enemy. And we make a big old table like Rollmaster, and you can get your hand chopped off or your head right, you're blinded or whatever. All cool. You make a giant D100 injury table, and it's fun those first few times that your friends are like laughing because they get, right? They kill the one troll by shooting it in the eye with the arrow or something, and it's pretty cool. But one thing to keep in mind is that now we've introduced sort of a weird little tiny asymmetry in the game. And that is because, in a lot of cases, the injuries won't matter to the NPCs. They might matter in that you might take out one or two big NPCs with something, right, with a weird crit or something or another. But injuries that are lingering, so, oh, your player broke his arm, or your guy got a skull fracture and now can't see straight or can't cast spells. None of your NPCs are going to ever be bothered by that because they will likely be dead by the time it matters. They will be out of the plot by the time it matters. But your characters on the 4th level of the dungeon, who now have concussions and broken jaws and cracked ribs and all these little lingering penalties, that matters to them. And now you've created an asymmetry that penalizes characters, PCs, and really doesn't matter to the NPCs. And so back to Runebear. In Runebear, we had not a huge injury table, but there was the original version of Runebear had a big injury table, and you could break stuff and smash, and fingers and hands and blindness and, right, a whole host of bad things could happen to you. But as as we moved on with the game, you realize, most of the time, what that rule does is it makes your character less fun to play for a while. And yes, you can absolutely injure an NPC and end a fight or two. But in general, the lingering injuries that might pile up suck for PCs and don't matter to NPCs. So in later versions of the game, we nerfed the table. Now, the problem with that is that it's less flavorful. The sucky part, it's not flavorful. You get impaired as opposed to your arm shattered or whatever. And we reduced the number of lingering injuries so that most of the injuries, some of them might stick around. You have impairs and you have windeds and so crippleds, and those stick around. But a lot of the things on the wound tables now go away, and we added sort of the concept of shock, does more damage, right? It brings you to the end of the fight quicker, kind of thing. To sort of balance out and put less things on the PCs that they had to suffer through that the NPCs would not have to deal with. And like I said, if you did this injury table in, say, 1st edition D&D, very asymmetrical. You didn't think it, but it was a very asymmetrical sort of rule. So similar rules. So again, as an interesting, for instance, I will pick up my own game. There's a fatigue system. If you wear armor, your fatigue number increases, and as things happen during the day, you might have to roll, and if you roll that fatigue number less, you get fatigue. There you go. And fatigue is something that I can use to re-roll against you. And again, how often do you think I'm going to track fatigue on the dozen NPCs that my 6 PCs are fighting? That's a lot of extra tracking all of a sudden that I'm going to have to do. So guess what? I probably don't track fatigue on NPCs. So in that way, it's very asymmetrical, and it's sort of unfair because the only thing fatigue can do is sort of penalize the players. Not a great rule, necessarily. If you think about it in a vacuum, it's not a good rule. Now, the reason the rule's there is to make a penalty, an explicit penalty for wearing heavier armor, which is a benefit which otherwise becomes the obvious solution. Everybody wears as heavy armor as they possibly can pick up and as heavy as they can afford, because it just has enough benefits in terms of combat to make it worthwhile. But there's fatigue, which is going to allow me re-rolls. Now, keep in mind, in Runebearer, the players have re-rolls in the form of inspiration, and monsters typically do not. So I used fatigue as a way to sort of balance that rule out. That was symmetrical in that it only benefited them. And I used fatigue as a way to make a trade-off on their armor to fatigue and to give me rerolls in a fight. So in that sense, I think I balanced it okay-ish. How's that? I remember playing the 5th edition, the Lord of the Rings, and they had journey rules. And the journey rules were either you had a ranger or you eventually got to your destination, but you took exhaustion and you took penalties. And it's like, this is very asymmetrical. Will we ever come to an encounter and they go, oh, yeah, all the bandits are fatigued. They're exhausted. They also had to go through the rainstorm. No, never. You would never come upon that unless it was like a scripted encounter, right? Every encounter you were going to do, you would be the one getting penalized. When you got to the dungeon and you had 2 levels of exhaustion and your morale was bad and you were despairing because of the Dark Lord or something or another. And I'm like, man, this set of rules sucks because it is only asymmetrical, and it's only asymmetrical against you, essentially. So I think my point, and this is going to be, I'm going to cut this one short because this is long enough. I think it's interesting. It's interesting when we write our rules or when we add homebrew or when we make those decisions, those rulings to cut out a spell or to nerf something. Like, what are the unintended consequences of that? And are we doing something that is going to be applied equally across the board of all, say, combatants, NPCs, and PCs? Or are we doing something that is only going to impact our players and probably weirdly penalize them? Because that's sort of, strangely enough, when we add more detail to a lot of things, what you realize is what you're actually doing is you're adding a lot more ways for your characters to get bad modifiers, probably. So that's it. I mean, there's nothing more to it. I just thought it was interesting. I said all the discussions about hit points versus attrition system versus an injury system got me thinking about one of the nice things about hit points was it was just symmetrical. It was simple and it was symmetrical. I knew that both sides were taking hit point damage, and that's it. Even that's a tiny bit asymmetrical in the sense that you're never going to come across a group of foes where they only have half their hit points for some reason, right? You're typically going to come across foes with full hit points. But again, that plays into the nature of D&D as sort of a resource management and resource expenditure game. So, I mean, that's sort of core to the experience, I suppose. This was sort of a rambly one. Did it come to a point? Yeah, the point is, think about this stuff a tiny bit when you change the rules or make a new rule. Does this rule only screw your players? And if so, maybe not. Maybe don't do that. Okay? All right. I'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.